Welcome to the Productivity Show podcast, where we believe that you can get the important things done without having to sacrifice your health, family, and things that matter to you. My name is Tam. I'm the founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, where since 2011, we've been helping people become more productive at work and in life. And today I'm joined by my co-host, Brooks Duncan. How's life, Brooks?
Life is great. No complaints at all for a change.
Well, hopefully that's going to stay that way because one thing we're going to be talking about today is checklists. And I think checklists are an interesting topic because they help prevent problems from happening in the future, but also make your life a lot easier. And we've been doing a podcast since 2016 and 423 episodes in, we still haven't talked about checklists, which is quite surprising. So I figured we would talk about it today. And what the power is of having a checklist, what checklists you need to have. There's actually three of them that we recommend. And then also how you want to make sure that you're using them. And so we're going to be addressing all these different things, and don't overestimate or underestimate the power of a checklist. No matter how simple it might be, the humble checklist is extremely effective and efficient. So we're going to be talking about that here today. And as always, I'd like to kick things off with our top three favorite resources. And Brooks, what are they today?
Yeah, so if we're going to talk about checklists, we of course can't ignore the granddaddy of checklist books, and that is called the Checklist Manifesto. I think that is the thing that got a lot of people really thinking of the power of checklists, is by Atul Gawande. So if you haven't read it, really recommend checking that out. That's number one. Number two is the official bullet journal notebook. Now, you don't need any special notebook to do a bullet journal, but if you are interested in doing it, there is an official one that has everything kind of like all set up for you. So that's something you can take a look at. And number three is another book. It's called The Goal, a Process for Ongoing Improvement. This is really one about systems and constraints and bottlenecks. I actually really enjoyed this book. This is actually a great candidate for an audiobook, I feel. But if you want to read the book, that is great too. Either way, you can find links to everything that we talk about in the show notes. So go to theproductivityshow.com/423. So Tan, you mentioned we're talking about checklists. How are we going to start? What checklist do you recommend people use first?
Yeah, we have three of them, and we're going to dive into them. I do want to give a quick shout out to our next week's episode, just in case you don't know, or you might be wondering what that is. We're going to be going over industry news and trends, so be sure to check back next week as well. But speaking of checklists, so there's three checklists that I think everybody needs. And the first one is a task-specific checklist. So for example, in aviation, when pilots are flying their planes, they have a pre-flight checklist. So before they take off, they have to go through a checklist just to make sure that everything is good to go before they go up in the air. And failure to correctly conduct a pre-flight checklist oftentimes leads to major accidents. In fact, in May of 2014, there was a private plane that crashed where 7 people died. It was a tragic incident. And the National Transportation Safety Board, which is an independent U.S. government investigative agency for investigating transportation accidents, what they ended up doing was they downloaded the data from the aircraft recorder and found something really interesting. Of 175 takeoffs that this plane has done, 98% of the time, they went up in the air without completing the complete pre-flight checklist. In other words, it was a habit of the plane crew that took off without checking out all the safety precautions and going through the whole checklist. So this is a really bad thing what they found this out. And to put that in a different context or in a different perspective, this whole incident, this plane crash, could have been prevented if they went through the checklist, because the major issue that they were having was one of the gust locks was still engaged when it should have been disengaged. And part of the pre-flight checklist is to actually make sure that it is disengaged. And so it just shows you how such a simple concept of a checklist can save lives, but also when you're so experienced and you have done something so routinely and so often, it's easy to assume that you know everything that has been taken care of, when in fact, all the little details can make a big difference. And so that includes for both you and I that are here on the show today and that are listening, because I've done a lot of things that I go, yeah, I've done this 100 times. I kind of know what to do this. I've done 400 plus episodes now of the podcast, but it's still useful to go through checklists just to make sure, like, oh, do I have the D&D settings on my phone, right? Do I have X, Y, and Z in place? And sometimes I do forget one of those things, even though I've done this thing like 400 plus times. And so that's why I really want to encourage you to make sure that you have checklists in place for things you do routinely.
Yeah. And it's a good thing that you highlighted the routine tasks too, because the routine tasks are like the danger zone, right? If something's like complex and new to us, generally, that has its own set of challenges, but focus and forgetting things is not one of them, because you're like really focused in on it, you're paying attention. But the routine tasks, memory can fail, attention can fail, and it usually happens at the worst times, right? You could do something 95 times out of 100, but it's going to be one of those 5 times where something blows up. And it could be something really minor, like you gave the example of recording a podcast. It could be something really minor, like you forget to make it so that people in the live stream can chat or something like that. The world isn't going to end when that happens, but you've also shown with your example that the results of this can be really, really deadly. And the solution isn't to like somehow focus harder. Like the solution isn't try some way that you can like really focus in and be into it. The solution really is to make it so that you don't have to focus harder. And by putting together a checklist, you know what you need to do without having to think of it. Now you need to use the checklist, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But step number 1 is having it there and visible. I mentioned the checklist manifesto earlier, and I think the author put it really well in the book. He said, checklists seem to provide protection against such failures. They remind us the minimum necessary steps and make them explicit. They not only offer the possibility of verification, but also instill a kind of discipline of higher performance. And I think that makes a lot of sense. When you have the checklist, you know what needs to happen. You don't need to figure it out. You know every single time. And by having it like that, that's like a springboard for higher performance, for more productivity, for more focus, by having that kind of like safety net there. Now, almost anything you do can benefit from a checklist, but what we would recommend is start with some of the higher value important systems. Like you don't need to go nuts making a checklist for every single thing you do in your life and your work and that sort of thing. I mean, maybe they can all benefit from it, but start with the 80-20 stuff, the low hanging fruit. Like think of those really do. Think about those things you do on a regular basis that's important, and kind of start from there. So like if I think about what we do kind of routinely, Tan, you mentioned the weekly podcast episode. That is something we have a checklist for. I learned that lesson very early in my podcast hosting and production career, that trying to like remember what to do is a recipe for disaster. So we have a checklist for everything related to that. When we are putting together like a new resource, we have a checklist for that. When we release a new blog post, a new email newsletter, checklist for that. Pretty much everything we do has a checklist. Now, Tan, the checklist that we do have, one thing that question we get a lot is, where do you put your checklist? Like what form do they take? So maybe you can talk about, at least from an AE perspective, some of the things we do for our checklists.
So most of our checklists are in Confluence. So this is a product by Atlassian that we use. So if you use anything like Jira or Slack, it's all kind of like owned or co-owned by Atlassian. So we're a big fan of that because we're going to like integrate it in the whole ecosystem. So that's the platform that we use. However, you don't have to use that specific platform. For my personal checklist in my personal life, I use Evernote for that. So I have a notebook called Checklist, and I have all my personal checklists that are in there. So we use Confluence kind of like on an enterprise level or company level, and then Evernote, or you can use something like Notion, right? Or OneNote. These are all things you can use. Whatever note-taking system or app you use already is probably suitable for that as well. So I know some people have even like Apple Notes, right, and use that for very simple things. And if you think about like your grocery list, that's a checklist in a way too, because most of the time you end up buying the same stuff anyway, like 90% of the time. So think about it, you're already using a checklist. It's not something you're new to. Imagine doing that for all the other things you have going on in your life. And in fact, at AE, we have like over 530 checklists or SOPs, sometimes as we call them as well. And the SOPs are slightly different, right? Because an SOP is kind of like step one, do this, step two, through this, and make sure you're paying attention to this setting, blah, blah, blah. Whereas a checklist is more like, hey, did you do this? Check. Did you do that? Check. Do you have this? Check. Right. So it's a slight variation of it, but the idea is the same. When you have this documentation in place, you're not trying to solve new problems every single time, right? So imagine if you have to make sure that the airplane is ready to go. If you don't have a checklist, you're trying to, one, rely on your memory, which we all know is a bad idea. Two, you're trying to solve the same problem over and over and over again. Like before we take off, do I have to close the door? Like what do I do when I close the door? Do I, do I have to like put this thing here, that thing there? Like you're trying to solve a problem that shouldn't be solved. With a checklist in place, you're just checking off what needs to be done. So that's another way to think about this as well. And so all the other things we have going on in our lives, especially if it's a routine or something we do on a frequent basis, whether it's even just once a week, can probably turn into a checklist. So whether it's stuff you send to your bookkeeper or to your accountant, even if it's just once a quarter, that could be really helpful, right? For me, when I organize dinner parties, I have a checklist at home where I make sure like, okay, let's make sure my place is clean and there's like necessary items in the bathroom. I make sure I hide certain things. Making sure my place is ready. Like there's all these things I go through, and having done a lot of hosting, I now know like, okay, when someone comes over for dinner or something, or I'm organizing something, here's the checklist I need to go through. Same thing when I go travel and I want to work out at a hotel, I have a checklist specifically for hotel workouts. It's not something I'm trying to figure out on the spot, right? I asked my trainer one time, I said, hey, when I travel and I go to a hotel, can you create like a simple workout program for me, like a checklist of like, do 100 squats or something, or do 100 push-ups or whatever. And then every time I travel, I don't think about it. I just pull out that checklist and just follow that workout in order. And it's really that simple. Same thing for this is a little bit more advanced, but for my executive assistant, I have checklists as well. And I say, hey, anytime we're booking a flight for me, let's make sure we go through this checklist of like, okay, Tan likes the ale seat, right? I'm not a window guy unless I go overseas and go over the ocean. Then I'm more of a window guy because then I can take beautiful pictures of what's going on. But also for my personal assistant that comes to my home, of all the things I would like her to do on a weekly basis, like watering my plants or trimming the plants or getting groceries or cutting fruits or whatever, and that kind of stuff. Or even as complex as like doing a thinking trip. When I do a thinking trip, which is really oftentimes used for quarterly planning or kind of reassessing my goals, which I tend to do once a quarter, I want to make sure certain things are in place. Like my accommodation is within walking distance from a grocery store or a restaurant. Like that's one of the checklists that is required for booking something like that. So you can get really creative, and there's all these things that you can do to create checklists.
Yeah, the thing I like about checklists too is they can be really, really simple. Like you said, you can just have an Apple Note, or even just using the reminders app on an iPhone or something like that. They can be super, super simple, or they can be complex, or even next level stuff. Like I have some checklists, like I said, that are literally just a list in reminders, but I have some other checklists that are associated with my task manager, which is OmniFocus. And I kind of like set those up using a shortcut, which is a iOS and Mac automation tool. And it gets a little nerdy. And for those things, that's more appropriate. So I like how you can kind of like do a bunch of different things with them. In the live stream to this recording, which we always record with our TPS Plus and our Productivity Academy members. There's some discussions of what people use for their checklists. Alice says she uses Evernote just like you for her personal checklist, but she also uses Habitica, which gamifies regular tasks. And there's a big discussion about gamifying your checklists and stuff like that. So that's the thing I love about checklists. They can really take almost any form, but either way, it really helps you out.
All right, so that is tip number one here, right? So we want to make sure that you have a task specific checklist. So think about all the things you do on a regular basis. Now, before we move on to tip number 2 here, the second type of checklist that you need, I want to give a quick shout out to our TPS Plus members and subscribers. So if you want to have an upgraded version of the podcast, then go to theproductivityshow.com/plus. So that is PLUS. So what does that mean? Well, you get episodes ad free. You get them a week early. Plus, you get a bunch of bonus content as well when you become a subscriber. So people oftentimes ask us, hey, I love the podcast, but how can I contribute to the podcast, or how can I reward you guys for this? Well, the best way to do that is to go to theproductivityshow.com/plus and become a member of TPS Plus. Plus, if you pun intended, become a member and you get the annual membership as well, you get a really cool t-shirt that says one tweak a week. So that's something that we always believe in, is that if you can make an improvement every single week, your life is going to be drastically different. So that's a great t-shirt to have. So if you see someone else wear that t-shirt, you know that they're a TPS Plus member. So I want to thank everybody who's been supporting us thus far, and I encourage you to sign up. All right, so let's move on to checklist number 2 here, and that's specifically for travel and packing. So if you've been following us for a while, you know that I travel quite often and that I also use a travel checklist. In fact, we did a whole episode on this a while back in episode 252. So you can go to theproductivityshow.com/252. But I remember, and this is a story I haven't shared with anybody yet, what inspired me to start creating this checklist was I had a speaking engagement many years ago in North Carolina. And what was great about the speaking engagement was that I could fly in the morning and then leave the next day. So it was a really quick trip, and I was able to get paid to speak, make a big impact in a crowd, and then check out some barbecue as well, North Carolina barbecue, and then go home the next day. I was like, okay, what a great trip, right? So I was really excited about it. And I thought, oh, since it's just a 24-hour trip and I've done a lot of traveling, let me just pack my stuff and didn't, think about it much, and I should be good to go. So I arrived at the hotel and my phone was almost out of battery. So I thought, oh, okay, I need to start charging my phone. And as I was trying to find my charger, I realized, oh my gosh, everybody's worst nightmare, I didn't have my charger with me. And so I had to figure out how do I charge my phone? And I asked the front desk, they didn't have anything for me. Sometimes they have it at lost and found. So that's kind of like a hack too, is if they don't have it, you can ask them, hey, is there anything in lost and found that I can use? And they didn't have anything either. So then I thought, okay, now I had to go to the Apple store, right, and figure out if I could charge my phone. But then because I landed and my talk was in a few hours, I didn't have that time. And so I was trying to figure out in between what to do with my phone. So that was kind of a problem. But then also, as I'm about to rehearse for my talk, I realized I left my clicker at home. And I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't bring my charger. I don't have my clicker with me. This is not going well whatsoever. And then as we were preparing the deck for a presentation, then the slides didn't load on screen. And then I had to start rehearsing or speaking from memory, which was kind of tricky. But luckily I had given that talk many times, so I kind of knew what to talk about. But it was just one disaster after another disaster after another disaster. And so from that moment, I said, okay, you know what? One, I need to have a checklist in place, which I kind of had already, a really basic version, but I also need to follow it no matter what. And so it's kind of like the law of the universe. No matter how experienced you are, especially when it comes to travel, if you don't have a checklist, or if you do have one and you don't follow it, you will forget something.
Yeah, this is especially true, I found, since a lot of us are kind of out of practice from regular travel after the pandemic. And so even if we did have things pretty nailed down, now that we're kind of getting back to it, it's a lot more difficult because we're a little more out of the routine. So I think a lot of us are really feeling this, but if you have a checklist, you never need to worry about it. Like you said, in that episode that we did a while ago, episode 252, you and I both went through our travel checklists, some of the things on there that I pulled out. Go listen to the episode to hear the whole thing. But some of the things is organizing a SIM for the country that you're going to, if relevant, or these days use an app like Airalo to do an eSIM, maybe your passport or Nexus or global entry card, clothing based on the weather, eye mask, travel scale, activated charcoal, which I learned from you, which has come in really, really handy on some trips. Things like a Chromecast or a Fire Stick or a Roku so that you can watch your stuff no matter where you are. And just like chargers for your various accessories and gadgets. You know, you might have a USB-C cable or a lightning cable, but forget your Apple Watch cable or something like that. So those special ones that sneak up on you. And of course, you know, checking into your flight at the regular time. Whatever you have on your checklist, you know, you're going to have your own stuff. But one tip that we would definitely give you is after you do a trip, evaluate all your packing and travel lists and see, is there anything you didn't need? Is there anything you wish you had? Kind of like after every trip, kind of adjust and improve over time. I did this last year on a camping trip. I did a solo camping trip on myself. I just went, backpacking to a river near here, and I didn't use a checklist because I was just like, you know, you're just throwing stuff in your backpack. What's the big deal? And I realized I forgot to pack pants. So it was getting a little cold at night. And I realized, wait a second, all I have is my shorts. So that was like, I first of all improved and started making sure to use my packing list, but I made sure that pants were on there no matter what. And I vowed I would never skip using a checklist again. So make sure you're always like reviewing and iterating. All right, that is tip number 2. So the second type of checklist that we're going to use is a travel and packing checklist. Now we're going to go right into number 3, and that is rituals, review, and planning checklists. So we talk a lot on the productivity show about doing your like morning routines, your planning, you know, weekly planning, daily planning, quarterly planning, that sort of thing. But the question is like, how do you know what to do and how do you do it in the most efficient way? Like for myself, another example of this is the GTD weekly review. We've done episodes on that in the past as well. And I always struggled being consistent with my GTD weekly review. And part of it is because I needed to find the right time and location. But the other part of it is then I would sit down to do it and I just kind of like have to figure out what to do every time. So now I've kind of like turned it into a checklist, and I sit down with my coffee at Starbucks on Sunday morning, fire up my GTD weekly review checklist, which I have in my OmniFocus, my task manager, and I just go through it. I don't need to think about what I need to do. I just go like, I sit down, open my laptop, grab my paper and notebook, and go into pure execution mode. And it's made a really, really big difference. And the thing about using checklists for these is it kind of helps solve 2 problems with being consistent with doing reviews and doing planning. Number 1 is, of course, actually doing it. And number 2 is making sure that you're doing the right thing. And a checklist can help with both of these because it reduces the friction of getting started. I don't know about you, Tam, but for me, that is always like a big point of friction for me for doing this type of thing is actually getting started to do it. And having a checklist that you know you don't need to think about, you just need to follow, makes a big difference for that. And number 2, doing the right things, since everything is there on the checklist, like we talked about with that quote from Checklist Manifesto, it's like the minimum required things, you're way less likely to skip important steps. So some examples of checklists that we recommend, and Tan, I'm curious which of these you use. Number 1 is a RISE ritual. So we talked about that recently in TPS407. So that's your ritual for when you start your day. Number 2 is a shutdown ritual. So we talked about that recently in TPS 350, and that is the checklist for the ritual you have when you're ending your day. And then the GTD weekly review, like I talked about, and also for doing your planning, your quarterly, your monthly, your weekly, and your daily plans. If you have checklists for those, it's way more likely that you're actually going to do these things. How about you, Tan? What kind of like ritual and planning templates do you use?
Yeah, I have all of these. And one thing I've noticed is if I stop using them for a while, so let's say, for example, I skip my morning routine for like, let's say a week or 2, then I might forget what the actual steps are to get back on track. And so if I'm trying to solve that problem again, I might have to do some research and then like read a blog post or listen to a podcast episode again to kind of get re-inspired of what I want to do. Or if I had a checklist, then I don't have to solve that problem again, right? And that goes back to the thing I was saying earlier is when you have a checklist in place, you're not trying to solve problems, you're trying to execute. That's two different things. And it saves so much time and energy. And something we talk about in our 25X program all the time is we want to have as many routines and rituals in place and ideally checklists to kind of keep us on point so that we don't have to think about it. We just do. And the more we can do, the better off we are. So another way I always like to tell people about this is if you're willing to invest 20 minutes to create a checklist, then future you is going to really love you for it. And you are probably going to win back like 5 minutes every single time you execute that checklist. So doesn't it kind of make sense? Doesn't the ROI make sense to do this then, right? Spend 20 minutes to get 5 minutes back here, 5 minutes back there. If you do it once a week, let's say you do it even just, maybe imperfectly 40 times. So 40 times 5 is like 200 minutes. So that's like, roughly 3.5 hours a year. Like, I think that's totally worth it, right? So, checklists are very high leverage. And so if you're willing to spend a little bit of time upfront to create them, you're going to be benefiting from it over and over and over again. Because yeah, you're going to save time, but also too, you're more likely to follow through. So your momentum is not going to get lost. So if you ever do fall off track, it's easier to get back on track because you don't have to think and trying to solve a problem. You already have it figured out because you did all the heavy lifting and thinking way beforehand, right? So another lesson I've learned from all of this is the best time to solve a problem is when you're not in a critter state, right? When you're like angry or emotional or like you're upset. Like that's the worst time to solve a problem. The best time to solve a problem is when you're calm, collected, focused, right? And then if you're willing to spend 20 minutes on creating that checklist, then anytime you're not feeling that great or you're like you're a little tired or you're like, not feeling the best, you can still follow through on the checklist because it's relatively easy to do and execute. And so I would encourage everybody to, create that checklist. And so before we wrap up today's episode, again, the third checklist we recommend that everybody has is, for rituals, for reviewing and planning. And so I would ask you, like, what's one checklist that you can create today? What's the one thing that stood out to you here today? Was it for planning? Was it for reviewing? Was it for traveling? Was it for maybe a routine task that you have going on where you go, oh, yeah, that's the one I should really create a checklist for? Whatever that might be for you, write that down right now and create a checklist today. Spend about 15, 20 minutes or so, even if it's just imperfect, like bullet points in a Google Doc or something. That's way better than having nothing at all. Okay. Next week, we're going to be talking about productivity industry trends and news. So I'm really excited for that to make sure we're all up to date on that. And everything we talked about today, you can find in the show notes by going to theproductivityshow.com/423. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next Productive Monday.